Okay.
All right, this is an interview at the New York State Military Museum, Saratoga Springs, New York, the 20th of August, 2004, approximately 2:15 p.m. Interviewers are Mike Russert and Wayne Clark. Could you give me your full name, date of birth, and place of birth, please?
Yeah, my full name is Master Sergeant, retired, James A. Schaeffer. Date of birth is 24th of May, 1943. Place of birth, Pottsville, Pennsylvania.
Okay. What was your educational background prior to entering the military?
I had 12 years of high school.
Okay. Did you enlist or were you drafted?
I enlisted
Okay. Why did you select the Army?
because it was a 3-year obligation. At that time they had the draft, and when you're 18 years old there's not really many opportunities for jobs, so I elected to go into the service and get my career service time over with.
Okay. Where did you go for your basic training?
Fort Dix, New Jersey.
All right. How long were you there, and what kind of training did you receive? Any specialized training there at all, or was it just...
No, it was basic training. I was with Papa Company, the 2nd Training Regiment, and it was an 8-week basic training course. From there I went on to Fort Bliss, Texas.
And what kind of specialized training?
There I was in the missiles, Hawk Continuous Wave Radar Maintenance, and I elected to drop out of that, and I went on to Fort Carson, Colorado for advanced individual training.
Why did you decide to drop out?
I didn't know anything about electronics.
That's a good point. Okay.
What kind of training did you get at Fort Carson?
Fort Carson, advanced infantry training.
Okay.
Now, what do you mean by advanced infantry? What did they do there that was
Well, it's
advanced?
basically the same thing as basic training, only more advanced. Marksmanship, patrolling, tactics.
While you were in 61, what kind of weapons were you using?
Back then we had the M1 rifle and the BAR, Browning automatic.
Mm-hmm. When did you go over to you probably went over the M14 first?
Yes, went to the M14. That was, I believe, 64.
What did you think of the M14? Did you like that over the M1?
No, I liked the M1 rifle. I think it was a more accurate weapon. We used that when I was stationed in Alaska. I was on the ski firing team. After Fort Carson, Colorado, I went to Fort Wainwright, Alaska in 1962, and I was on the Biathlon ski firing team in competition. We took USARAL championship.
Now, had you skied before you went into the service? So you had to learn the skiing and...
I had to learn to ski in Alaska. I put 1,000 miles on skis.
Was it mostly cross-country skiing that you did?
Yes.
Okay, how long were you in Alaska?
18 months. I went up there in 1962 and I left in 1963.
Okay, and where did you go next?
And then I went from Alaska to Fort Hood, Texas.
Quite a contrast.
Yeah, you go from cold weather to hot. And I was in Fort Hood till 1964, at which time I re-enlisted and was transferred to Fort Devens, Massachusetts.
So in 64 you decided to make a career with the military?
Yes.
Okay.
Did you still hold the infantry MOS, or did you change
I kept the
MOSs?
11 Bravo MOS.
Okay.
And in 64 I went to Fort Devens. 65 we were transferred to the 1st Infantry Division and we left for Vietnam.
Okay. What were your first impressions when you arrived?
In Vietnam?
Yes.
Didn't know what to expect. It was hot. We had to declimatize in Canto, and then we moved up to 3 Corps, Phuc Vinh, and we took over a Cambodian base camp. And at that time we went over to Vietnam with the M14 modified with a selector switch. Then they gave us the AR-15, which kept jamming, And then they went from the AR-15 to the AR-16.
Now you went through a variety of weapons. Which did you like the best?
The M1.
M1, still going back to the M1. I noticed, I think it was in your form, no it wasn't, it was someone else I read today. Oh yeah, the AK-47 you thought was a much better weapon?
Yes.
Did you ever...
Than RM-16s.
Mhm. Did you ever switch over to using one
No.
at all during your tours there? No. Okay. All right, you want to just tell us about your first tour in Vietnam?
We arrived, left out of Fort Devens, went to California, got on the USS Breckenridge, and troop ship, went into Vietnam. And as I said, we had to sit down, lay down, if you will, and become declimatized and get ready for all the heat. And then we got up into Phuc Vinh, and we didn't see much action for the first month. We had snipers shooting at us, but other than that, we didn't have much going on. And then we went into Michelin rubber plantation. We're looking for the Tato 2 VC battalion. It took us 3 months to track them down. And constant running patrols, ambush patrols, sweep and destroy operations. General Depew was the division commander at the time. And in April of 1966, we walked into a VC base camp, which we lost quite a few of our men. I was with the 1st and the 2nd, which was Black Scarfs, they were known as over in Vietnam.
Why were they known as that?
What?
Why were they called that?
We wore a black
Or
scarf
scarves,
around
okay,
our
that was the
necks
Okay.
with a white 1 and 2.
Mhm. Okay. How do you rate? Did you ever have contact with the South Vietnamese Army at all?
Not on my first tour. I did with the second tour. And when I left Vietnam the first tour, I didn't have a real appreciation for what the Vietnamese people were going through. Mainly because, as I said, we were on sweep and destroy operations. We had very little contact. We did cordon type operations where we'd surround villages, and then they'd have intel people go in and check the villagers out to see if we could find the VC or VC sympathizers. But on my second tour, when I was on the mobile advisory team, we worked with the popular forces and the regional forces and the PSDF, the People's Self-Defense Force. So I had a much better appreciation for what the people were going through themselves.
How do you mean? What do you mean by what they were going through? Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
My first tour, as I said, we had very little contact with the Vietnamese themselves. As a soldier, I felt I was fighting their war. But then when I went back in 1969 on the mobile advisory team, and I had to go into these villages and see what they were up against, because the RFs, the regional forces, and the ARVN would go into the village telling the people, we're here to protect you and take care of you and let us know where the VC are, and then they would leave. And then the VC would come in at nighttime, and they'd be threatening them, their lives. The village chief would be threatened, and the people, all they wanted to do was their little livelihood, which was growing rice, get up at the break of dawn and work all day out in the rice fields, and then in the evening, when the sun went down, they went to bed. And that was their day. But they didn't have any security to speak of, and living conditions were terrible.
Could you explain the differences between the regional forces and the popular forces?
Regional forces, these were the guys, they were from different villages throughout the region. The popular forces, these were Vietnamese fighters, which we gave them our World War II rifles. They had the M1 and the old Thompson submachine gun. They were from a village in itself, and they were there. They were similar to what our National Guard is. but most of them came out of a certain village and area. And the People's Self-Defense Force, they were living right in the village. They operated strictly out of that village and provided security for the village.
What was your impression of them as fighters?
Of which group? All three of them?
Yes.
Well, they didn't have a lot of training, and that was our mission as mobile advisory teams. We were to go in there and teach them marksmanship training, teach them tactics, go out with them on operations, and try to flush out the VC. They, a lot of times, weren't interested in doing that. All they wanted to do was go to the local district and pick up their supplies, their rice, and things of that nature. And the lieutenant in charge of each group, he had the money for all the soldiers in his platoon, and he controlled that. So they really didn't know how much money they would get, and it was at his beck and call. He'd give them what he thought they should have.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in your second tour, did you encounter North Vietnamese regulars?
No.
So both your tours, it was basically against the VC.
Yes.
How did you feel about them as a fighting force?
They were, for what they had compared to what we had against them, they were very ingenious. This Tato 2 battalion that I spoke about, we spent 3 months trying to find them, and they had an underground hospital, and we finally discovered it. And where they had big caves, and when they would operate on a soldier, they would take him and put him back in a dungeon, so to speak. And the operating table was a mound of dirt. And they did that to keep them protected so that when we were dropping the bombs, they would be safe. So, and they were able to move quickly through the jungles. They'd have caches of rice, and they'd have ponds where they kept fish so that they could eat on the run all the time. So compared to us, with all the modern technology and the equipment and the artillery and the bombers flying over, and here they were fighting with just AK-47s, B-40 rockets, things of that nature.
Did you suffer many casualties from booby traps? Or?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What about
And a lot of it was our own negligence.
what about tropical diseases like malaria? Any problem with that?
No, we didn't have a problem with that.
How do you feel, you went back in the States, I believe, I'm looking at this as an instructor in some areas?
Yes. In 1966, I left Vietnam, and then I went on to Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And then from Germany, they shipped me right back to Vietnam, '69. And while I was in Germany, I was with the 23rd Ordnance Company, which was nuclear warheads. And we had an ammunition storage point and a pre-storage point. I had 80 soldiers under me that I had to put in both these different areas. And then I went to Vietnam, '69 to '70. 1970, I went back to Fort Hood, Texas. From there, '71 to '74, I was in Germany. And then I went from '74, I went to Fort Benning, Georgia. And there I was a TAC NCO with the basic NCO Academy. And I did that for a year and a half. And then I became the operations NCO for Allied Student Training Division. We trained Allied officers from all of the NATO countries that came in for airborne training, Ranger, Infantry, IOBC, and officers basic course. And then from there I became a drill sergeant for 2 years.
Now, did you use any of the lessons from what you learned in Vietnam? Do you think we learned anything from the experience there?
Well, I think we did, but at the same time we kept up with our doctrine in training. When I was the drill sergeant, we were running them through a AIT, Advanced Infantry Training, and it was basically the same thing as what we were trained in. The only thing is more modern, up-to-date weapons.
How did you feel about the rotation system that we used in Vietnam?
I thought it was great.
Individual rather than unit rotation and so on.
Right, because then you knew you had a year to do. And so you knew that in 1 year you were going home. So I like that a lot better. Of course, the downside of that is you get new men in, you don't know them, where with the unit rotation, you're familiar with everybody in the unit.
How do you feel about the rules of engagement? Do you think we are hampered by them?
Yes,
In
very much so.
What ways?
In fact, when the Tet, New Year's, the Vietnamese New Year's, when that came up, we were all instructed that we were not to fire unless fired upon. And so I didn't particularly care for that, because here I am in a combat zone, and at any given time, you know, snipers would shoot at us, but they're telling us not to engage the enemy unless they're firing on you.
What did you think of Westmoreland?
I didn't know the man. I didn't have any contact with him at all. I didn't particularly care for him. General Depew, we were chasing a Vietnamese regiment, VC regiment, into Cambodia and getting ready to surround them, and Westmoreland ordered us back into South Vietnam. So, as a soldier, I didn't like it. You know, here you are, you're in a combat and you're tracking these people down, and you've got them now where you've got them in your grasp, and you're told, and I felt it was for political reasons, we were told to get back into South Vietnam.
Okay. Did you have much you didn't have much contact with the Vietnamese people themselves the first tour, the
No.
second tour you did? How did you
Second
feel
tour.
about, I know you've talked about a little bit about the people themselves, though.
Well, the people, we did a lot of med caps where we would go in with the Korean doctors, and they'd come in by helicopter, and then we'd go into the village and inoculate the children and examine all of them. And the people were very poor. One television set in each village, no medical supplies or facilities to speak of, and so here we would come trying to assist them, and all they're trying to do is their livelihood, which was rice. And I've had a deep appreciation for them. They're caught between the rock and a hard place. You know, you've got the VC coming in threatening them, you got the South Vietnamese government telling them we're here to protect you, and really they weren't protecting them at all.
You mentioned that there was one person, when you filled this form out, that you thought was someone you particularly remembered from being in service, an Afro-American. Could you tell us about him?
Yes, it was Staff Sergeant Bracken's, Alan Bracken's. He was my squad leader. I was his team leader before we left to go to Vietnam. And on the troop ship going over, we would sit down in the evenings and talk, and both of us had the agreement that all we wanted to do was bring all the squad back to the United States alive and in one piece. And of course, when we got into South Vietnam, when I got my first Bronze Star, we walked into a base camp. And at the time, I was transferred out of his squad to another squad to act as the squad leader, because the squad leader had gone back to the United States on emergency leave. And we walked into this base camp. I got with Sergeant Bracken's, and we decided we would try to push through and infiltrate it. And with all the fighting going on, when everything calmed down and we could take a count, I went back looking for him, and he had been shot. So we had a lot of discussions going over. A lot of times in base camp we would talk. And being African American back in the 60s, they didn't have a lot of privileges as they do today. And so he would say all he ever wanted to do was buy a piece of property up in the state of Washington, fence it in, and stay there. So I had a lot of respect and admiration for him.
Were there ever many tensions between blacks and whites and so on in your units, in the field or in camp?
Well, we had one African American, I'm sorry, he was Caucasian, from Florida. Went into the EM club at Fuquevin and pulled out a .45 pistol and started shooting up the place, shooting at African Americans. And he was then transferred out, shipped back to the United States, Fort Leavenworth. That was the only incident.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times, high school students who I taught after I retired from the Army, I taught at Christian Brothers Academy as a junior ROTC instructor. And a lot of the kids would ask me about drugs. And 65, 66, we didn't have that problem. The guys would drink a beer, but as far as marijuana or drugs of any type, there was very little of that.
How about your second tour?
My second tour was only 4 of us
Oh, okay.
on
you
the
were
mobile advisory
advisors,
team, 2 lieutenants, myself, and a medic.
Mhm.
And we lived with the Vietnamese, so we weren't about to do drugs or get high or drink because our lives would depend on one another. We had a Vietnamese interpreter that stayed with us.
Were you aware of the peace movement back home?
Yes,
How did you feel about it?
I didn't like it at all. I didn't like the idea when I came back from Vietnam and landed in California. We would change into civilian clothing, and we had people out there demonstrating, and we're over in a foreign soil giving our life, putting it on the line, and Americans back home can't even support us.
Do you think we learned from that war, for example, with the Iraqi war right now, that some people can be against the war but not the troops? Do you think that was something that was learned?
I think it's something they've learned, but they haven't learned the real lesson yet because they're still demonstrating.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a known fact that the Vietnamese War, the North Vietnamese were ready to give up. But with all the demonstrations going on in the United States, they continued to fight. And I think that's what's going on with the Iraq war as well. I think a lot of them would quit and give up. But the fact that there's demonstrations going on here in our country, they don't like that. They're not going to give up.
How did you feel about Jane Fonda?
If I was president of the United States, I'd have taken away her American citizenship.
Do you ever read much on Vietnam at all?
No,
Movies?
no.
Watch any movies or anything?
Like I tell the kids, the movies are all they're trying to do is make money. So they glorify the war. I was there 3 months before we ever got shot at. So we earned our CIB 3 months after I was in country.
Okay. So most of your duties then after you returned from your second tour, you went to Germany and you were an instructor.
Right.
Correct.
And then I went to back to Fort Hood, Texas. I was with the 7th Cav, always in the infantry. And then I requested junior ROTC duty because I was getting close to the 20-year mark. And I said, well, if I'm going to become a civilian after spending 20 years in the Army, I better learn how to be a civilian again. So I requested JROTC duty, and they sent me to LaSalle Institute in Troy.
Okay. How did you feel about your experience there?
In LaSalle,
LaSalle, yes.
I enjoyed it very much. And from LaSalle, I went over to CBA after I retired. Because LaSalle already had 2 retirees. At that time, they were authorized 2 active Army instructors and 2 retirees. And they had the 2 retirees, so I wasn't allowed to stay on once I retired. And then Brother William at Christian Brothers Academy made contact with me and asked me to come to work there.
Did you join any veterans organizations at all after you
I
left
belong with the
service?
VFW.
VFW, okay. You ever stay in contact with anyone that was in service with you?
No.
The reason or just...
Well, everybody moves around, and you lose sight of people. I've been trying to make contact with one of the guys that was with me at Fort Devens, but I haven't had any luck. Joseph LaBelle. He was from Queens, New York. But so far I haven't been able to track him down.
How do you think your time in the service had an effect on your life?
Well, in many ways, the leadership, the discipline, I think has made me a stronger and a better person. I try not to think about the combat zones. Those are things, that we all have different things that happen to us that for one reason or another we don't want to talk about, but the most appreciative thing that I can think of is going to work with high school students. And I've been able to talk with a lot of them, help a lot of them with making decisions. In fact, Mark, right now, is trying to make a decision, and we went to dinner the other evening, and that was part of the discussion is, should he join the National Guard or should he just wait it out? So, I think the military service was good for me.
Okay. Do you have any questions? Okay, well, thank you very much for your interview.
You're welcome.